Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video, I want to tell you guys some of the best Azeroth trades that you can use for Outlaw. I want to try to break down which trades for Outlaw are good, but I'm not just gonna take a look at them from a roll the bones perspective. For any of you guys that just hate roll the bones and would rather play slice, I do want to give you guys an alternative. I also want to take a look at all these trades from a PvP, PvE situation and kind of how I break them down. Some of the trades that are worth running, some of the trades that are not, trades to look out forward to, and kind of how you should approach them depending whether you PvP or PvE. And also answer the question of when is it a good idea to forego your spec specific traits to take more of a middle ground approach, when they're useful, when they're not. All to help you guys figure out how to build your character, if there's any alternatives to your builds, and what pieces of gear to look out forward to when it comes to building your Outlaw and doing well in Battle for Azeroth. The first trait is called Storm of Steel. Extra strikes from Sinister Strike increase the damage of your next dispatch. I thought this one was actually going to be the one that you would end up stacking as much as you can after coming out from Outlaw from Legion. In Legion, Dispatch, or at the time Run Through, was our biggest damage ability, so I thought beefing that up with Sinister Strike sounds like a good idea. But when it comes to practice, you actually end up running this as kind of a dead trait. You see, this trait is good when you have a good set of buffs and you're getting the procs and sinking them into Dispatch. As an Outlaw Rogue starting with Roll the Bones, you're going to invest a good chunk of your common points first into rolling the bones a couple different times. Once you get a right buff, then you can start investing common points into your finishers. And by then, you haven't really got used to get the most out of this trait, and it becomes useless and dead when you haven't to reroll. With Slice and Dice, however, this becomes a little bit stronger, and in PvP situations, this is generally a good trait. I feel like if you had to draw a line where you would kind of take a trait if nothing else is good or not, this one is the line. If you have something that's better than Storm of Steel along the middle ground buffs, it actually is worth replacing. But if you have nothing better, Storm of Steel is going to be a reliable damage increase, no matter how you look at it. Snake Eyes is actually a very interesting build. It is very unique, very niche, and not a terrible one for all the bones. But for Slice and Dice, there's a particular build called the 2-button build, the Snake Boy build, which allows you to have a 2-button rotation and do fairly decent damage. It works around Slice and Dice, and I have a link for that down in the description below for you guys to check out if you're interested. Outside of Slice and Dice and Wombo Combo, this buff is actually not a terrible buff. This is kind of like the lowest end where you still have a damage increase, and especially viable for PvP. Especially for all the bones, you're probably going to be re-rolling for buffs whenever you are trying to get a better buff, so having your Sinister Strikes do slightly more damage supplements for damage without you getting a right set of buffs. But once you have a right set of buffs, you stop rolling, so there's no need for you to keep re-rolling for Sinister Strikes, so this buff becomes mute and silent once you get a decent set of buffs. Like the first buff that we talked about, this one has moments where it's just basically dead, so it's a decent one for PvP, I would say. If you're having to reroll buffs from time to time, it supplements extra damage that you would otherwise lose out on, which is why I actually don't really mind this buff whatsoever. Snake Eyes is, again, interesting buff, has some viability. I feel like this buff is gonna get nerfed for the Slice and Dice build. But again, check out the description down below if you want to find a build with Snake Eyes. Other than that, unless I have nothing else, I would probably not pick Snake Eyes if I could help it. The next buff is called Paradise Lost. Take control of the Dice of Fate, granting yourself extra agility if you roll only one buff. This one has very interesting synergy with Slice and Dice. And if you're playing Slice and Dice Outlaw, this is a buff you want to look forward to, unless you go for one of the bigger buffs. So this one would probably be a lot better than Storm of Steel. It'll be a little bit weaker than Snake Eyes for Slice. For Roll the Bones, this can be a decent buff, but it's kind of like a safety net more than anything. When you're looking for traits, you're looking for things that will increase your damage, and you're trying to increase damage at all times. With Roll the Bones, this one ends up providing you a little bit extra agility, so allowing you not to have to reroll for a decent set of buffs. The thing is, with Outlaw, our damage doesn't have to go from buffs, so it's a good idea to reroll until you get that perfect buff so you can really increase your damage. Technically, you can get yourself a buff that's not really that good right now, like True Bearing for example. And while you have a bunch of agility to go with it, the buff simply just doesn't add a lot of interactive gameplay. Again, it's also mute during certain moments, like when you have 2 buffs or 5 buffs. This buff simply just doesn't get any use out of it. This is why Paradise Lost ends up being kind of sort of decent for maybe some slice and dice situations, but not a lot of situations in general. So if you roll the bones, you don't want to go for this one. Although I do want to try to get triple stack of Paradise Lost with Slice and Dice to see how well does it work. I want to see if it increases the general damage that I might put out, and maybe even try with some of the different Roll the Bones builds. Once I get enough gear, of course, which is probably going to happen in a few weeks. Deadshot is the Outlaw Rogue legendary coming back as a trait, and it works even easier. There's no more blunderbuss procs to line up. To give you guys an example of how strong this trait is, my dispatch at 5 common points without external buffs hits for about 10k. A Deadshot buff by itself after a Between the Eyes, and I get a Sinister Strike proc for a half off pistol shot, and I'm running Quick Draw as a talent, hits for about 9k. So a Deadshot pistol shot that's buffed up by the Sinister Strike proc with Quick Draw as a talent can hit for almost as much as a finisher. So you can chain a finisher into a free proc of Deadshot, and that's actually so much damage. Like the rest of the Outlaw Rogue traits, I know that this one stacks, as I tried it before, and the damage that you can get, especially if you crit with external buffs, is insanely strong. If you ever get this one, you basically won the Outlaw Rogue lottery. The next trait is called Brigands Blitz. Adrenaline Rush increases your haste by 71 every second, stacking up to 10 times, lasts 20 seconds. So during your Adrenaline Rush, you will get yourself a nice fat haste buff, and you'll be able to use Maximus version of the haste for the last 10 seconds of your Adrenaline Rush. Now this is actually a decent buff, especially if you're somebody who's brand new, leveled your character, and you need a little bit extra haste. But as we get better haste values with gear, this one really starts to fall off. I wonder if you could run some kind of a very low haste build, with maybe with high mastery and triple stack Brigands Blitz to get some kind of insane burst out of it. But right now as it is not really a trait that I think is worth stacking in any measure. And finally for Outlaw we have Ace Up Your Sleeve, or Ace Up Your RNG. Each combo point spent on Between the Eyes increases the damage done and grants a 2% chance to gain 4 combo points. Now I've been doing research because I don't have the tools that everybody else seems to have when it comes to trying to figure out the RNG of an ability. And I spent some time hitting a train dummy with Ace Up Your Sleeve, and I'm still not quite sure. This one is very interesting, and I would love for Blizzard to add a little bit more tooltip, like which parts of a trait stack. This one, however, I'm pretty sure the damage stacks, so the damage of Between the Eyes will be higher, but I wonder if that 2% chance per combo point to gain extra combo points is something that also can stack. So 2% chance for 5 combo points is going to be 10% combo point stack. Times 3, you'll have a 30% chance to gain 4 combo points, so basically it's almost like a refund for you Between the Eyes. With how often you Between the Eyes, it's actually something worth grabbing, especially if you're getting a crit buff back to back to back. But the common points that you may get, this is how I do with this trait. This is actually not a terrible trait, it's just very RNG. The damage increase is definitely going to be there, but the common points you can get out of it are very, very sporadic. I feel though that this is a buff that you would want to run as a trait combo with Deadshot. Deadshot will give you extra damage in your pistol shots, and you're going to be burning that Between the Eyes anyway, regardless whether you have the crit buff or not, because that pistol shot damage on the proc is strong as is. So if you run at least one Ace Up Your Sleeve with 2 Deadshots, that actually might be worth extra common points at random and extra damage for you Between the Eyes, especially if it crits, is not going to detract you. So this one is one of those that's actually very interesting, so you can kind of combine it, and this is probably the first one that I've seen where the combination actually can kind of sort of work together in this weird build that you can run. But of course, on its own, I don't think it's worth stacking. I think by itself, it's not really all that valuable, and there's issues with it that I have in terms of the build and the playstyle. It's very, very unique, but because of its uniqueness, I feel like it has, on its own, some drawbacks. Now, I want to talk a bit about not spec-specific traits. For example, let's say you have a variety of Outlaw traits, but none of them are Deadshot, and you can't really see a clear combo. What are some of the alternatives, and which traits should you look out for that are not spec-specific? Well, first of all, you should avoid all traits with Mastery, at least for Outlaw Rogues. Mastery traits don't affect our damage that much. Mastery is probably our worst stat for PvP and PvE. There is some possibility for Mastery to be decent with Slice and Dice, maybe at later endgame with higher gear, but right now not having enough haste is going to force us to go to as much haste as possible. Second rule is if that trait deals damage, whether it's a bleed, whether it is magical damage, just no condition, just deals extra damage, generally it's a good trait to take because it's going to function a lot like a random trinket. Imagine that trait is just a third trinket that you have that's not quite as powerful as a dungeon trinket, but it'll just randomly deal damage to an enemy. Hell, some of those traits have the same percentage of damage as an undead racial. So in some sense, you could think of adding or tagging to your character a watered down undead racial for random shadow damage at random. Some of those can be viable in PvP, like for example, Child of Razan can put a bleed on a rogue. If a rogue tries to vanish from you, as an outlaw rogue you don't really bring any dots, but being able to have a bleed on an enemy that tries to vanish away from you can be somewhat useful. The last rule that I have with traits that are not spec specific are some of the traits that force you to stay in a location. There's a lot of those traits that either will give you maybe extra agility, maybe extra critical strike, maybe extra haste for staying in place. And those can be viable in PvP and PvE situations, but they're very situational. And it all depends on what you're going up against. If it's a boss fight and there's a lot of mobility, you'll generally want to avoid it. If you're somebody who does a lot of PvP, rogues can and should avoid it, but they have some capabilities to maintain that as a buff. Since rogues are all about stuns, you can actually lock someone down in place. And if you have one of those Azeroth trades that give you extra stats spawn right on top of you, that can be insane damage increase for you and your team, whether in battlegrounds or arenas. So you kind of really have to evaluate them for yourself, figure out if you do a lot of movement in PvP and in PvE, and try to decide for yourself whether it's worth. But if you're not sure, as always, stick to the rest of the other rules that I have. As long as it's not mastery, and as long as it tries to deal any extra damage, those are generally decent traits if you're not quite sure. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoy it. Hopefully you guys found this guide at least a little bit helpful when it comes to crafting your rogue and making a build for PvP or PvE, slice and dice, or roll the bones. Let me know in the comments below if you want me to cover this type of video or a similar style for Subtlety and Assassination if you guys are having trouble with those specs. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.